Good morning. Welcome to another Great Decisions. I'm Dr. Cindy Miller, President of the World Affairs Council, and Dr. Regina Karp is the Chair of Great Decisions. So on behalf of Dr. Karp and the rest of the Council, we welcome you to another session. I'd like to remind you to finish your food and turn off your phones. And again, the mics are working great today, but of course if there's issues, just raise your hand during the presentation so we know to adjust. The Council would like to thank the Virginia Arts and Humanities Commission for a generous grant in support of Great Decisions. And as you guys know, this is a grassroots effort. There's over 90 some Great Decisions, or World Affairs Council across America. Great Decisions is one of the things that they can offer. Upcoming events, Thursday, just to remind you, this Thursday coming up is the Powerful Influence of African Americans in International Affairs. It's a program we're doing at Hampton University with Ambassador Ruben Brigady. He's the Dean of the Elliott School and has extensive experience in foreign service, as well as Dr. Esther Brimmer, who is also with the State Department. And that program starts at 6 on Thursday. And with that, I'm turning it over to Dr. Karp to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Cindy. Maybe I'm getting the call. Good morning again. Thank you all for coming out. Over the past few weeks, some of you have come up to me and complimented this year's speaker series, and I take a compliment very well. You know, it's nice to be complimented. But I want to give that back to you because, you know, your turnout, the quality of the questions that you ask, make this series what it is. We have tremendous talent, both in civil society in Hampton Roads and also at the universities. And it's especially wonderful today to welcome someone who is not from Old Dominion University, but from our sister university at William & Mary. And some of you may recall that Old Dominion actually started out as a branch of William & Mary before it gained its independence. Dr. Shushan actually is a return visitor to the council. And we realized earlier that when I thought last time she spoke here was maybe 3 years ago, we realized that she's the mother of 2 now, and so we probably last met about more like 5 or 6 years ago when she came here to talk about the Arab Spring. And today she returns to also talk again about the region, but with a special focus on Saudi Arabia, one of America's most important allies in the Middle East. And this is a troubled relationship, and I could think of no one better to talk about this than Dr. Shushan, who is a professor in government and also teaches classes in international studies over at William & Mary. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Shushan for today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karp. Really, it's a pleasure to be back. As Dr. Karp just noted, can you guys see me, by the way? I feel like I'm really short, if you hadn't noticed, so I kind of get lost behind this podium. The last time I was here, as Dr. Karp notes, I was in pre-K, which means pre-kids. And now I'm back. I have 2 little ones now. And I have lots of ties with the World Affairs Council, and also with Dr. Karp, whose son was a student of mine some years ago when he was at the College of William & Mary. I understand he's about to get married, which is fantastic and exciting. Congratulations. Or mabruk, as we would say in Arabic. As far as my own personal history with the World Affairs Council goes, it goes back quite a bit further than that Arab Spring talk I gave here some 5 years ago or so. When I was in high school, in the Philadelphia area, I was, in my senior year of high school, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia's Student Steering Committee. They had an amazing program for area high school students. We did things like a model Congress and model World Court and all kinds of fantastic programs. As you can imagine, World Affairs Council has a very special place in my heart, and I'm delighted to be invited to come back now that I've graduated from pre-K to K. All right, so today, of course, as you know, we're going to be talking about Saudi Arabia, and I've taken the
the charge to explore the theme of Saudi Arabia in transition as a mandate to talk about challenges that Saudi Arabia is facing, both at home and abroad. And I'm going to go through and kind of divide the talk into those two realms of domestic challenges and challenges in foreign policy. As I do that, let's see how well I can. All right, I'm going to come over here. As I do that, the first thing that I want to consider is the question of why Saudi Arabia is kind of a big deal, why it's important, why we should care about it. And the first answer, of course, that comes to mind is oil. Right? Saudi Arabia is important because it has quite a bit of oil. It produces in the neighborhood of 10.6 barrels per day of oil, which makes it one of the top 3 oil producers in the world. The other 2 that are up there as well are the United States and Russia, but the Saudis are the top oil exporter in the world. I have a nice little quote right here under the map of Saudi Arabia. I don't know how many of you are fans of The Daily Show, are fans of The Daily Show, or were fans of The Daily Show back when Jon Stewart was at the helm. But one of my favorite little skits on The Daily Show was about 4 years ago, 3-4 years ago, when Jon Stewart welcomed a character played by John Oliver, who was called Sir Archibald Mapsalot III. And Archibald Mapsalot III took it upon himself in this skit to redraw the map of the Middle East in true colonial fashion. Now that the Sykes-Picot map of the Middle East that emerged after World War I was out of date, he basically just haphazardly was redrawing the lines of the Middle East. And Jon Stewart asked him why he hadn't touched the map of Saudi Arabia, why he was leaving that intact. And Sir Archibald Mapsalot III answered, "Why would I touch Saudi Arabia, John? They're a good, decent, oil-producing people." So that tells you a little bit about why Saudi Arabia is important, and also undergirds the close ties that the United States has had with the Saudi government ever since oil was discovered in the kingdom in the late 1930s. Now, beyond oil, there are other factors that we want to think about as well as far as why Saudi Arabia is important. A second reason is that the Saudis are one of the key contestants, if you will, for regional leadership or hegemony within the Middle East. Now, this is especially true since the Arab Spring, or as I like to call it, the Arab uprisings, when many other possible competitors for that title of Middle Eastern hegemon were dramatically weakened as a result of internal protests and revolution. One example that comes to mind would certainly be Egypt, right, which had been a major mover and shaker in the Arab world, and thanks to all of the transition and domestic chaos in Egypt, its position has been weakened, right? Of course, even before that, and we'll talk more about this, you have the sidelining of Iraq, right, after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, which basically takes out Iraq as a major player and contestant for Middle Eastern hegemony. So since that time, since 2003, and especially since 2011, with the field of possible leading players in the Middle East being narrowed, the Saudis have really emerged with a much more aggressive foreign policy in the region than they had ever had previously. And as we'll talk further about as well, this has manifested in a contest between Saudi Arabia and the other leading regional player, which is Iran. And that has taken the form of a series of proxy wars within the Middle East. Now, one thing to note about Saudi Arabia is that in this contest over Middle Eastern hegemony, and especially the contest between the Saudis and Iran, the Saudis are a status quo power, right? They are conservative, not only domestically in terms of their own affairs, but they also want to try to preserve the status quo in the region as much as possible. And this generally aligns pretty well with US foreign policy interests in the Middle East, which tend to be fairly interested in preserving the status quo. Okay, further reasons that we should care about Saudi Arabia, that it's kind of a big deal, is the role that the Saudis play within the GCC, or the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is a 6-country council within the Arab Gulf. Among the Arab Gulf states that are members of the GCC, the Saudis are by far the most populous, with their population of about 30 million, and play a leading role within the GCC. Now, in addition to that role within the Arab Gulf and the GCC, you also have the leading role that the Saudis play within the Muslim world. Now, of course, the 2 most holy sites within Islam, in Mecca and Medina, are both located within Saudi Arabia. That gives the Saudi king the mantle, or the ability to claim the title of custodian of the 2 holy mosques in Mecca and Medina, right? Which lends a considerable Islamic legitimacy to Saudi Arabia within the broader Muslim world. Saudi Arabia is a leader within a multilateral Muslim organization of Muslim-majority countries called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which has its headquarters in Jeddah on the western coast of Saudi Arabia. And of course, in its role as a leader in the Muslim world, there are a couple of other things that we'll want to think about and talk about. One is that Saudi Arabia has been a supporter of Salafist or fundamentalist Islam. And at the same time, it's also been on the receiving end of terrorist attacks by radical Islamic groups. Of course, including Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and it has been a partner of the United States and other Muslim countries in the fight against ISIS, or the Islamic State. So, some reasons why Saudi Arabia is important, and things that we want to keep in mind when thinking about Saudi Arabia. Now, as we proceed, as I mentioned, what I'd like to do is divide our attention between domestic challenges and then foreign policy. And I'm going to talk about domestic challenges first. We'll start at home within Saudi Arabia. Okay, now, in terms of challenges for Saudi Arabia, the thing that I have to put first, we started out with oil, right? Oil is what gives Saudi Arabia a considerable amount of its power, its importance, its leverage on the world stage, right? Saudi Arabia, just a historical reminder, right? Saudi Arabia first really burst onto the world stage when it used oil as a weapon. Anybody remember, when did Saudi Arabia do this? The first use of the oil weapon by the Saudis? 73, well done. All right, good job, folks. Right, so 1973, in the 1973 war, right, when the United States was supporting Israel in the 73 Arab-Israeli war, the Saudis for the first time used the oil weapon against the United States, right, by instituting a boycott and driving oil prices up. That also was tremendously helpful to the Saudis, because that tremendous boost in oil prices really helped to fuel the development of a state with a modern and expansive bureaucracy, right, along the lines of what the Saudis have today. Now, the Saudi economy is extremely dependent on oil. As you can maybe see, I don't know, how well can you guys, looks like it's a little small.
Not well at all.
Not well at all. All right, so let me help you out with what you can't see very well. So, the Saudi economy is very dependent on oil. 42% of its GDP, or gross domestic product, 87% of its government revenue, and 90% of its export earnings come from oil, right? So the fluctuation in oil prices is extremely important in terms of the health of the Saudi economy. Now, one reason that this is important, right, this is important in many ways, of course, but it is important in terms of the Saudi use of what political scientists and economists and political economists honest, called rentierism, right? Rentierism, a rentier state is a state, a government that receives a substantial portion of its government revenues from the sale of commodities to outside sources, right? So for major oil exporting countries that bring in large amounts of revenue to the state, we call them rentier states or rentier economies. Now, rentierism has been extremely important in Saudi domestic politics because it has been the foundation of what we could call the implicit social contract that underwrites stability within Saudi Arabia and the willingness of the public to tolerate an extremely non-democratic regime, right? So the bargain that is made, right, the bargain is made is that the government uses what we could call taxation and spending effects. So what that means is the government basically spends a lot of money in social programs, subsidies, right, etc., in order to make the population as a whole relatively happy and content and meeting a certain standard of living. It also does not levy taxes, right? So the spending effect and the taxation effect. The argument that political scientists have made, right, is kind of flips on its head the saying that we in the United States are very used to, right? No taxation without representation. Well, in the context of rentierism, we flip that on its head and we get no representation without taxation, right? If people are not taxed, right, and their standard of living is underwritten by the state through spending, they tend not to demand representation, right? The flip side of that, of course, is that if the state can no longer provide that same level of spending and it starts to levy taxes, you're likely to see popular demands, right, for political representation. And that, of course, would be very dangerous for an established regime. So the regime has used these taxation, spending, and also repression effects, right? When all else fails, you spend a lot of money on your military and police forces and intelligence forces to subdue any discontent that does arise, right? When the Saudis have faced domestic discontent, which has happened, and it happened, for example, during the course of the Arab uprisings, right? In January, February, March of 2011, as uprisings were unfolding throughout the Arab world, you did have protest movements unfold in Saudi Arabia, especially in the eastern province, which we'll talk more about, which is where the Shia population in Saudi Arabia is concentrated. So what did the Saudis do? Well, it won't be a surprise to learn that what the Saudis did to deal with this discontent was to launch a major spending package, right? $130 billion spending package to try to, right, to reestablish, right, that social contract and make the population happy enough that they would desist from protesting. And of course, the state also used repression as well of protesters where necessary. Now, the key thing here, right, is that oil prices have plunged since 2014, right? And they are likely to remain low for the foreseeable future for various reasons, mostly having to do with an increase in worldwide supply of oil. So prices fell from $145 per barrel in 2008 to a low in the past year in 2016 of $30 a barrel. They have since rebounded a bit to around $50-some a barrel as a result of an agreement among OPEC members, of which, of course, the Saudis are a leading force. OPEC members, these are members of the the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They agreed to drop their production levels to try to boost prices, and that helped somewhat, right? However, the problem for the Saudis is that it doesn't help nearly enough, right? The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, estimates that the break-even oil price for the Saudis, the level at which they can stop running serious government deficits, which they have started running since 2014, is $80 a barrel, right? So we are still a long way short of that. And as a result, the Saudi government has had to dig into its foreign currency reserves. Now, it does have substantial foreign currency reserves, but it cannot continue, right, to withdraw money from its reserves at this current pace for a substantial period of time. So the Saudi government recognizes that there is a need to change, right, the economic plan, an economic policy within the Saudi government. However, this is, of course, easier said than done. But there are plans afoot for the Saudis to reduce subsidies for key things like electricity, water, which of course is crucial, especially in that part of the world, and petroleum products. And significantly, because we've talked about the taxation effect, right, for the first time, the Saudis and the GCC as a whole are actually introducing a tax, right, and this is a value-added tax that's going to come online this year in 2017. Right, still relatively modest, but perhaps a sign of more of what is to come in terms of the introduction of taxation. The government is also pursuing privatization in key sectors like health and education. There are major challenges that lie ahead, and one of those key challenges economically for the Saudis is going to be creating enough jobs in order to meet the demand, especially for the substantial portion of the Saudi population that is below the age of 30. It's estimated at about 70% of the Saudi population, right? Those are young people who have been raised with the expectation that they would probably have the opportunity to have a nice cushy job in the public sector, right? With public sector employment, if the process of privatization and public sector employment drying up, there's a very important need for the government to be creating jobs, helping to spur the growth of jobs in private industry, and that's going to be a major challenge for the Saudis. Okay, there's probably no way that you can see that family tree up there, which is too bad. So let's talk a little bit next about family politics. We'll do our best here. So the Saudi political system is one that I and other Middle East political scientists would classify as a dynastic monarchy. Now, a dynastic monarchy is contrasted from another type of monarchy, which would be an absolute monarchy, right? An absolute monarchy is where you have a king or queen, although certainly typically a king, who is vested with absolute power in himself, which he doesn't have to share with anyone else, including with family members. What is unfolded in Saudi Arabia and in the other Arab Gulf monarchies, the monarchies of the Gulf Cooperation Council, is a different form of government, which we call a dynastic monarchy. This is family rule, right? Rule not just of a single king, but of a much broader family. Now, the progenitor of the Saudi royal family in the top left corner, who I'm sure you cannot see, my apologies, is King Abdulaziz ibn Saud. He was the founder of the modern state of Saudi Arabia, right? He helped to conquer the various regions that today comprise Saudi Arabia, right? Going beyond the region that the Al Saud family hails from, which is the Najd in the center of Saudi Arabia. He conquered outlying regions of Saudi Arabia, including, most importantly, the Hijaz, which is a much more cosmopolitan region on the coast, which contains Mecca and Medina. So Abdulaziz ibn Saud and his family members and associates created Saudi Arabia from scratch, right, in the early 1900s, and established the state formally in 1932. Since his death in 1932, over the 80-some years since then, one of his sons, right, I'm sorry, I completely have the dates wrong. He established the modern state of Saudi Arabia in 1932. He died in 53, my apologies. Since his death in 1953, power has rotated among his sons, right? Abdulaziz ibn Saud had 22 wives. He had over 50 sons, right? So that's quite a cohort to choose from, right, in terms of potential successors. And the way that these successors dealt with the question, and this is something that evolved within Saudi Arabia after the death of Ibn Saud in 1953, was the process in which the family, right, rather than having power pass through a system of primogeniture, right, to the eldest son, the family as a whole would decide on the successor, right? And the idea is that that helps to establish a meritocratic process, and also one with what we call the indeterminacy of succession, where everyone has a vested stake in the system, because he knows, right, all of the princes know, that if he can show himself to be qualified and capable, he has a chance of winning that leading role of becoming the next monarch. So you have this system of shared rule and decision-making by the ruling family. The advent of the petrodollars era, right, helped to create this vast bureaucracy, right, with various government ministries, so that for those princes and members of the royal family who didn't get the nod, they were likely to be content and invested in the system, not only because they had a chance to become the next king, but also because if they didn't get to be king, they would get to be minister of something, right? Get a nice office in a ministry with a very lavish paycheck and lifestyle. And so they would be willing, right, to accept the decision of the family. It incentivizes solidarity in the broader family interest. And along with oil, right, this has been something that has really helped to cement domestic stability within Saudi Arabia. Now, the big deal, right, I mentioned that since 1953 and the death of Ibn Saud, you have always had one of his sons as king. The big deal is that the next transition, right, after the current king, which is King Salman, who became king after the recent death of his brother, King Abdullah. The next transition after King Salman, after he passes away, and he is 81 years old now, will almost certainly be to a member of the third generation. That is a grandson of Ibn Saud. The current crown prince is Mohammad bin Nayef, who is a grandson. And the deputy crown prince is none other than one of the sons of the current king Salman, his own son Mohammad. And there is very little doubt that King Salman's ultimate goal is to bypass the current crown prince, if possible, and have his son inherit the throne when he passes away. So the question is then, will this new generation of rulers that is on the cusp of taking over in Saudi Arabia adopt different policies, right, than the older generation has? Will they be able to better connect with that 70% of the Saudi population that is under 30 years old, right? And another key question to keep in mind, right, because petrodollars have been so important in cementing the system of dynastic monarchy and solidarity within the Al Saud family, as oil money dries up, are we likely to see more internal conflict within the family itself that could impact things like succession? So those are some of the things that we want to keep our eyes on, I think, in the future. Let's see, how does no problem, we'll use that. Okay, now, other internal dynamics that we want to keep in mind are Islamic opposition within Saudi Arabia itself. A few things to say about this. Religion is very much woven into the fabric of Saudi society and Saudi governance and politics, right? There is no separation of church and state within Saudi Arabia, and this goes back very much to the pre-modern state era, when you have an alliance between the early progenitor of the Saudi regime of today. This was Mohammed ibn Saud, as he was trying to conquer territory very much locally around Riyadh, the family seat, which is now the capital of Saudi Arabia, and within the broader region of the Najd. He formed an alliance with a preacher named Mohammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And that alliance was a critical alliance in which Ibn Abdul Wahhab promised that he would, that his supporters, right, that his religious adherents would support the Al Saud family, right, and in turn, he expected that the Al Saud family would legitimize and help spread Wahhabi Islam, right, the sort of the brand of Islam that Ibn Abdul Wahhab was preaching, right? And so over time, the Al Saud family has been supported by the ulama. The ulama would be the clerical establishment, the Islamic clerical establishment, and they've been able to co-opt that establishment, right? There have been serious tensions, however, right? Including and most markedly in 1979, when Islamist opposition actually took over the Grand Mosque in Mecca, right? Because in order to highlight their demands of the Saudi regime, which they saw as corrupt, right, and insufficiently Islamist and Islamic. Since that time, you have had radicalization of Saudi citizens who, with the encouragement of the Saudi state, for example, went to fight with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s, right? Further radicalization occurred with the Gulf War of 1990-91, when the Saudi regime acquiesced to the stationing of large numbers of American troops on Saudi soil, which led to very dramatic opposition by some Saudi Islamists, including, of course, a pretty famous one named Osama bin Laden, who was the founder of Al-Qaeda. And so the Saudis, since that time, have faced some pretty serious threats from Islamists, both from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and then today from ISIS, right? At the same time that the Saudis, right, with their close relationship with the clerical establishment, have done so much to promote the spread of Salafist or fundamentalist Islam abroad, this has really come back to hurt them in very substantial ways with the growth of groups like the Islamic State. And of course the Islamic State, which has declared its own caliphate and its leadership of a caliphate, would like nothing more than to incorporate the two holiest cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina, into that caliphate. So Saudi Arabia is very much in the crosshairs of ISIS. Okay. Now, whoops, let's go back. All right. Now, on the other hand, so we talked about conservative pressures on the one hand, but the Saudi regime also faces more liberal pressures, more progressive pressures on the other hand. And women are responsible for a significant amount of these pressures, both women who are human rights activists more broadly and also specifically pushing for increased rights for women. And of course, there's plenty of room in Saudi Arabia to increase women's access to basic rights. This includes things like, as you can see here, I think you can probably see the Saudi version of Rosie the Riveter here, right? We can do it, we can drive, right? Saudi women famously are not allowed to drive, and so there's been a campaign among Saudi women for the right to drive. This has included things like women taking selfies of themselves driving and posting this on the internet, which is a radical act in Saudi Arabia. On the right here, I love the artwork of this Saudi artist who started a campaign. In Arabic it says, Ana walayat amri, which means I am my own guardian. That is an attack on the system in Saudi Arabia of what is called guardianship. It is the policy, right, wherein which women have to have male guardians, and in order to do things like get a passport, get an education, travel abroad, you have to have the permission of your male guardian, right? So here, this very subversive artwork with a woman wearing the traditional keffiyeh, which of course only men wear, women never wear them, saying, I am my own guardian. And on the left, a video. Has anyone seen this video that's gone viral? if you Google Saudi women music video, you will get this video right here. I'm going to play, hopefully, inshallah, God willing, as we say in Arabic, a minute, right, that the problems that they witness in their subjugation by Saudi men at home is something that women in America might experience here as well. Certainly some subversive attacks and progressive politics that are going on within Saudi Arabia, and especially being driven by Saudi women. Okay, let's see. I encourage you, by the way, to go if you can and watch the whole video, because it's pretty awesome. All right, I'm having trouble advancing this. I might need a little...
Click out of the slide.
Sorry?
Click out of the video, back to the slide.
Okay, so just... I can't seem to do that. Yep, not working. Technology. You see, if I were teaching a class at William and Mary, you know what I would do? I would say to my students, who are a couple of decades younger than me, one of you has got to know how to work this stuff better than me, so come up here right now and help me. Okay, thank you. Now this gentleman is not a couple of decades younger than me, but you know, just about anybody knows how to operate technology better than I do, so thank you very much for that. Okay, now, one other domestic issue that I want to mention is unrest by the minority Shia population, right? The Shiites, which are, of course, a sect within Islam. They are a minority within Saudi Arabia. They constitute about 10 to 15% of the overall Saudi population. And they are concentrated here, let's see if they are concentrated here within the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. Now the eastern province of Saudi Arabia is important for the most substantial reason that much of Saudi oil and oil production is concentrated in the eastern portion of Saudi Arabia. So unrest by the minority Shia population, which has many legitimate grievances, including, for example, the fact that oil revenues, which come out of the eastern portion of the country, typically leave that eastern portion, right? And Shia are not treated economically or politically as equals with the Sunni population. There has been unrest in this portion of the country, both during the Arab uprisings and subsequently. Right, this dramatically came to the fore in 2016, January of 2016, when the Saudis executed a leading Shia cleric, Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, who had been an opponent of the Saudi regime and even threatened to lead a secession of Shia in the eastern province. This also, right, this unrest between the Shia and the Sunni government, right, has also fed into and been affected by the conflict between the Saudis and Iran, right? Anytime there is Shia unrest within Saudi Arabia or within the broader Arab world, right, Sunni Muslims, right, and certainly the Saudis tend to see the hand of Iran, which is a majority Shia state, right, governed by Shia, as being behind that unrest, right? So this domestic problem is then related to regional dynamics and Saudi foreign policy. And that, inshallah, if I can get this thing to work, okay, there we go, is what we're going to talk about next, right? Challenges in Saudi foreign policy. All right, so this is a perfect segue into discussion of the Saudi obsession with Iran, which we can certainly, if you have questions, we can talk more about that. I think it's very interesting. So we talked about the Saudis as a conservative status quo power, right? Iran is the opposite of that, right? Iran is a revisionist state, right? Its Islamic Republic came to power, after all, through revolution in 1979 that overthrew a conservative monarchy, right? The monarchy of the Shah. And ever since then, Iran has been interested in exporting revolution, especially to fellow Shiites within the Middle East, right? And this is something that is a domestic security concern for many Arab regimes in the Middle East, and especially, as I mentioned, and relevant to us here, Saudi Arabia. Now, the problem for the Saudis is that Iran's influence has grown in the region, thanks in no small part to the United States. right? What did we do? What did the United States do that helped to increase the role of Iran in the region? What was that big thing we did? We invaded Iraq in 2003, right? The power that had balanced Iran within the region, the Sunni power that had balanced Iran, was Iraq. Now I call it a Sunni power because the regime of Saddam Hussein, of course, was a Sunni regime, despite the fact that Iraq is a majority Shia country. It was governed by a Sunni regime that helped to counteract Iran, and then in fact, as I'm sure you know, had gone to war with Iran in the 1980s, an 8-year war, the Iran-Iraq War. So when the United States invaded Iraq and overthrew the government of Saddam Hussein and paved the way for majoritarian democracy, such as it is in Iraq, right, we now have a Shia-led government within Iraq, which is closely affiliated with Iran, right, that has dramatically raised the power and profile of Iran within the region. And that has been extremely disturbing to the Saudis, as well as other Sunni regimes, and certainly to the other Gulf states. Now, the Arab uprisings that began in 2010 in Tunisia created a further power vacuum in the region, right? As you saw major Sunni states, like Egypt, as I mentioned, fall, their regimes fall, during the context of the Arab uprisings. And since then, since that time, the Saudis have been engaged in a series of proxy battles with the Iranians, right? We haven't had direct war with Iran, and you may not be able to see the quote, I'll read it for you. Deputy Crown Prince Mohammad bin Salman, he's the son of the current king, when asked if Saudi Arabia was likely to go to war with Iran, he says, "It is something that we do not foresee at all, and whoever is pushing towards that is somebody who is not in their right mind." So the Saudis certainly appear not to be interested in going to war with Iran, a country that is far more populous than the Saudis are. But instead, the Saudis have been fighting this series of proxy battles against Iran. We can talk about how those have played out in places like Bahrain during the Arab uprisings, in Egypt to some extent, and most dramatically within Syria and in Yemen. And we can talk about those cases if you'd like in the Q&A. Okay, battling ISIS, right? Another foreign policy challenge for the Saudis. We talked about ISIS posing a direct threat against Saudi Arabia. There is certainly anger at the Saudis in the United States and elsewhere, among many who see the Saudis as at least partly responsible for the founding of ISIS. I think there's a lot of blame to spread around there, by the way. We could talk about that. But in any case, certainly there have been allegations that at least private Saudis have played a role in funding ISIS and other radical Islamist organizations, if not the government itself. Now, the Saudis did help to establish in 2014 a 34-member Muslim coalition against ISIS and other Islamist terrorist groups. However, for the Saudis, battling ISIS, while it is important, has really taken a backseat to other priorities. And the most important priority is the one that we just talked about, and that is battling Iran. And Iran itself, of course, is also battling ISIS, right? And so that is something that's been a more important priority for the Saudis than countering ISIS. Okay, and we can talk about how that's played out again in Syria and in Yemen. Yemen certainly being a very important example right now of the ongoing civil war that the Saudis have been so involved in trying to fight the Houthi rebels who are supported by Iran and supporting the ousted president Hadi. The problem here is that in the process of fighting the Houthis, right, the Saudis have been distracted from fighting another potential rival, which is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, I want to close with a consideration of where the relationship between the United States and the Saudis is. That has been a very traditionally important relationship, as I mentioned, going all the way back to the presidency of FDR in the late 1930s after the Saudis discovered oil. Currently, the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia is in a period of profound tension and turmoil. Now, there are reasons for this, right? And that relationship really reached a nadir or a low under President Obama. There are reasons for this, right? One underlying reason for this is that the United States is simply less dependent on Saudi oil than we used to be, right? The United States has dramatically, with the shale oil revolution, increased our oil production, right? So having freed ourselves from at least some of our dependence on Saudi oil, the United States feels able to be critical and confrontational with the Saudis in a way that for decades we did not, right? So under President Obama, there was the famous, at least attempt to pivot toward Asia and away from the Middle East, right? Prince Mohammad bin Salman, who I just quoted, the son of the current king, and others in Saudi Arabia have been extremely critical of this. They see an absence of American leadership in the Middle East, and Mohammed bin Salman spoke about the United States, saying the United States must realize that they are the #1 in the world and they must act like it, right? They felt like under the presidency of Barack Obama, the United States was not playing that role of regional policeman that the Saudis had come to expect. There was a lot of tension between the United States and the Saudis during the context of the Arab uprisings. In particular, the Saudis were very frustrated with the United States for not doing much to support the embattled regime of Hosni Mubarak before he was overthrown. Mubarak was not only a close ally of the United States, but certainly a very close ally of the Saudis and a member of the Sunni front against Iran before his regime was overthrown. The Saudis have also been frustrated with the US over Syria, where they see the US as insufficiently engaged in the battle to try to overthrow the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The Obama administration was also willing to be critical of Saudi human rights violations in a way that the Saudis did not appreciate. And of course, one of the things that the United States did that was most grievous to the Saudis, given their relationship with Iran, was to sign the Iran nuclear deal with 5 other nations in the G5+1 in 2015. The United States has also been reassessing its role in Yemen, in which the US has played a supporting role to the Saudis with no clear benefit to the United States at all, especially as you see marked numbers of civilian casualties there. And then, of course, and this isn't something that the Obama administration was responsible for, quite the contrary, you have JASTA and this rather remarkable cartoon here. JASTA is the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act that was passed in Congress in 2016. This is the act that would allow the families of the victims of 9/11 to sue the Saudis in American courts, right? This was extremely popular in Congress and domestically in the United States. President Obama actually overrode the congressional vote, and then Congress actually, Obama vetoed it, and then Congress overrode Obama's veto. As you can see here depicted in the cartoon, this is the Saudi view of JASTA, which is basically the United States using JASTA to basically blow up the world system in which sovereign states have immunity in the courts of other states. And as I said, President Obama tried to block it, and Congress overrode his veto. So the question then is, and I will close with this, on the question of US-Saudi relations, whether they are likely to improve under President Trump. And I think that there are factors on both sides of the equation that might lead us to see further sources of tension between the US and Saudi Arabia under Trump, but also factors that might mitigate that tension. I'll just draw attention to a few things. As far as potential sources of tension, right, you have President Trump's anti-Muslim rhetoric, and going, of course, beyond rhetoric, and his promise during the campaign to institute a Muslim ban. Trump has actually, of course, gone ahead and signed his executive order, which is currently blocked by the courts, temporarily banning immigration by 7 majority Muslim countries. Now, Saudi Arabia is not one of those 7 Muslim countries, but as a leading state within the Muslim world, a leader within the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, this is something that has to be problematic from a Saudi perspective. You also, of course, have President Trump's criticism of U.S. allies, including Saudi Arabia, for free riding, right, on U.S. provision of defense and not paying enough for their own defense. And then you have this rather troubling, from a Saudi perspective, relationship between President Trump and President Vladimir Putin of Russia. This is a picture I took from The Economist of this past week, depicting the perceived, at least, bromance between, if you will, between Trump and Putin. And this is particularly a problem for the Saudis in the Syrian context, right? Because the Saudis, of course, have been engaged in this 6-year-long civil war to try to overthrow President Bashar al-Assad. The Russians are a key ally of Assad's and Iran's, and it looks like President Trump is likely to be making nice with President Putin in such a way that may very well give Putin and Assad even more of a free hand than they currently have in Syria. And that will certainly be problematic from a Saudi perspective. On the other hand, right, you have factors that are likely to mitigate some of the tension that had emerged during the Obama administration. The most important of those is that Trump hates Iran, clearly, right? And he has made no secret of the fact that he thinks that the Iran nuclear deal is the worst deal ever made in the history of mankind, alongside with other deals that he said similar things about, of course, like NAFTA. But that certainly puts Trump and the Saudis on some shared footing. There seem to be some, at least compared to the Obama administration, more perception of shared interests in Yemen. The Trump administration has already made, for example, Yemen focus of its counterterrorism efforts, as witnessed in that what has been called failed raid that Trump conducted very early on in his presidency in Yemen. And the Saudis will certainly like the fact that under a Trump administration, they are much less likely to receive criticism over their human rights violations than was the case under the Obama administration. So, I know that I've just thrown quite a bit at you in terms of domestic politics, and foreign policy, and Saudi challenges. And I understand now, if I'm not mistaken, we're gonna have a little break, right? Maybe some food for thought, and then I'm excited for our Q&A together. Thank you so much for having me.